Hello and welcome to Your Life in 10, Series 1, Episode 8, with Bournbrook's digital editor, myself. Enjoy.
And in many ways, you're a bit of what I'm sure your friends would say, they certainly say it of me, of an old man. You like things being quite old-fashioned, to the extent that I can imagine you going the long way around certain things, adopting sort of inconvenient habits. I mean, we talk about your smoking and joke about that a lot. And you've got an old case. I remember saying before that you store your cigarettes in, and you prefer rolling tobacco and all of this, which might partly be the cost, but I imagine you also prefer that aspect anyway, because that seems to be the sort of person you are. Where did that come from? Is that the old pubs, your parents, an old influence, or?
Yeah, no, I've always kind of been a bit of an old soul. I used to, I don't know. I suppose it's my parents to an extent. I mean, through them, I was introduced to older music from maybe the 60s and 70s. But I suppose most of it comes from just the books I read as a teenager. From the age of about 15 onwards, I've been sort of obsessed with this sort of idyll of the early to mid 20th century. And the era from, I suppose, the end of the Victorian era to the Second World War is in terms of fashion and manners and sort of mannerisms. That sort of I suppose that was it. I was kind of, and I made this point in the last episode of OCP, but the sort of, I suppose the defining sort of strife of my youth was a stammer, really bad stammer. Right. To the point where I couldn't pronounce my own name. I think that kind of pushed me into books as a way of sort of escaping what was quite a mundane and generally quite embarrassing life. And so it's sort of, I think that pushed me into it, and it was more books than anything else, I think. But also my mum's Cornish, which if you go to Cornwall, it's almost like it's in a time lock.
Absolutely.
It's sort of, it's weird. It's like kind of stuck in the late 20th century, and this is sort of, I don't know, there's an idyll there that I quite like.
Wales as well, but perhaps Wales even more. I mean, Cornwall has been changed slightly by the fact it's so popular, whereas no one goes to Wales, it seems. certainly certain parts of it, like Anglesey, which is a ghost town, there's nothing for miles, but when you do reach somewhere, it is very, very old-fashioned. I think there's something about the people, which is quite nice, actually. There's something quite nice about that. But of course, you live neither in Wales nor in Cornwall, so how, where you do live, do you sort of feel you fit in with the modern world? You talk about preferring manners and good dressing, all these sorts of things, at least a style of an older age, but of course not many people around you do prefer these things or adopt them. How does that make you feel?
Well, I don't think I do fit in with the modern age. That's kind of the source of a lot of my anguish, is that I don't fit in with the modern age, and I don't particularly want to.
That's something you pride yourself on then, rather than something you struggle with?
Maybe not a pride thing, but it's something that I can't avoid. Something that I can't not do. Like, I remember, being about 2021, and I finally decided to actually start dressing the way I wanted to dress. Wearing sort of old suits and slacks, tucking my shirt in and that sort of thing. And I would remember I would be at like a bus stop or something like that, or in a pub, and I would overhear people sort of going, "Oh, what's he wearing? People who are wearing like track suits and jeans and whatever. And but yeah, I don't know. It's not really a pride thing. It's more like it's just sort of standard self-expression. If I wasn't to do it, then I would feel like I was being dishonest to myself.
Well, you said some of your influence then for all this was the books, so perhaps that might be a way of bridging into the first topic. So what's your first book on the list then?
Well, my first book is it keys in pretty much perfectly to what I was just saying, and it's Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. And it's a book that I've recently read for the third time, which is it's quite a long book. It's about 700 pages, and it's interesting. So we'll get into Maugham in more detail later on, but he's someone who I definitely resonate with. So the novel is based around it's basically like a Bildungsroman. So it's charting the path of a young man from boyhood to adulthood. I think it goes from him being 7 to around 30.
Right.
And it's very biographical without being autobiographical. In that it's so the character is sort of tormented his entire life by clubfoot, which is actually a stand-in for Morm's own stammer,
Right.
which held him back and made him, a point of derision at school and a laughing stock and that sort of thing. So yeah, I feel a remarkable sort of attachment to the character of Philip Carey, because when I read it, at different parts of my life, I read it when I was 15, when I was 21, and now that I'm 24. Oh, I was 24 when I read it, but I'm 25 now. And yeah, it's just, I don't know, like everything about it. I read it and I just think, it's just it's timeless because it's set in the Edwardian era, but it's timeless. It's someone who he's orphaned at an early age, which fortunately I wasn't, but it's him sort of struggling through life, trying to sort of mask his clubfoot, and at the center of the story is a tortured romance he has with a woman called Mildred. And it ultimately ends with them, not together, to not give spoilers, but yeah, it's I don't know, it's a very subtle book, because when people ask me what it's about, I can't really tell them what it's about.
That's
It's
usually the best books I find. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
no,
so many
absolutely.
books that are about nothing, really, other than just following the lives of certain
Right.
people.
Yeah,
But
no,
it
it's
always
about,
tends to be
yeah,
most interesting.
it's about relationships and growing,
About
and
people.
yeah. And but there's a character in the book who I really who isn't the protagonist, who I sort of like look up to. It's like that old saying, everyone wants to be Han Solo, but they're really Luke Skywalker, right? So
Right.
there's a character in the book who sort of comes in and out called Hayward, who's an Englishman that the protagonist meets while he's studying in Germany. And
Mm.
he's this sort of romantic, sort of poetic type who often gets, shown up during any sort of intellectual but he encourages Philip, the character, to embrace beauty in the world, and he talks about how he believes in the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I always, even though sort of I've changed with each time reading it, I still look up to Hayward in the same way, in that he's just this sort of aloof romantic who sort of just loves
Mm.
beauty and that sort of thing.
You first read that when you were 15, did you say, around
Yeah,
that
15.
stage?
Yeah, which
Well,
was which was probably at the peak of my stammer. It was
mm,
I used to so when you have a stammer, you have like certain trip letters. So mine were R's, D's, and W's.
right.
Seven that my surname, and the bus stop I used to go to get to school was a D. So I would literally, what I would do is I would get a post-it note and I would write where I wanted to go on the post-it note, and I would show it to the bus driver and like pretend I like lost my voice. It was utterly humiliating,
Mm.
but it was formative. And reading that book and then going on to research Mormon, how he had the same thing, is it was big for me at that point.
Yeah. Well, as you said, we'll go on to him as a person more later. But you say it's sort of a timeless book. But I must admit, I've not actually read this book myself, but from some of the notes I've read on it and some of the quotes I picked up on, and even from us talking about it in the past, as we have done, it seems it may be timeless, but that there's many times at which it couldn't have been written. I mean, one of the notes which I read upon, which I particularly liked, was sort of a realization, the main character, I think, near the end, where you found that the simplest pattern is also the most enjoyable, simply of
Settling
being
down.
born, working, marrying,
Yeah.
having children, and then dying, and sort of argued that that seeking for happiness was actually leading to the opposite, and that stopping doing that and simply living life in some of its
Mm.
simplest forms was the best thing to do. But of
Mm.
course, you can't imagine that being written, say, well, certainly not today, or even in the 60s or the 70s,
Right. Yeah.
and years in between. But still, an important message for those times. So, how do you think an audience today? Obviously, we know how you received it and how it's impacted you, but how do you think people more generally would take this book today? Would they find it to be quite stuffy, do you think?
Well, it's it's hard to tell, because I one thing I'm not particularly good at is putting myself in someone else's shoes, right? So I'm not sure, but I think it's just the book is so well written and the characters are so either profoundly likable or profoundly readable when they're not particularly likable. I don't know. I think the only person who would, I think, have a bad response to it is someone who would go into it, cynically minded, looking to mine it for awful things. And basically, the end of the book is, basically a sales pitch for monogamy.
Right.
Which, again, I'm not sure how well that would go down, but it's just, I don't know. It's such a wonderfully written book, and one thing Morm does expertly is he covers a very long period of time in a few paragraphs, and then a 5-minute exchange in 5 pages. Like but to answer your initial question, I really, I don't know. I think it's the kind of book where it's just relatable to anyone. Doesn't matter what your political persuasion is, no matter what you think of, his final revelation at the end. It's just a book about someone who is insecure, who is stunted by something, and just sort of figuring life out, which I think anyone can relate to.
Yeah, I suppose an important point as well is that the best way of making somebody believe something or expressing an idea seems at least to be through fiction. There's the famous quote that once upon a time is and always will be far more effective than thou shalt not. You pick up on certain messages. I mean, the character that you say you looked up to, I'm sure the way that they lived and some messages they would instill through that character probably had more of a lasting effect than some diktats you were told by a teacher at a young age, or ruled by others as well, and certainly by the government today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's it. There's at the start of the book, he's orphaned in the first chapter of the book, and he's sort of sent to live with his aunt and uncle, and his uncle is very cold and unfeeling. I think like Morm's real uncle, and he goes to this this boarding school where he's horrifically bullied for his club foot, and he's forced to expose it to everyone else, and that's something. And again, it's something that I can relate to. I had an awful teacher in year 9 who seemed to take some sort of sadistic joy in making me recite in front of the class, knowing full well I'd trip up. And yeah, it is hard to read at times. Like the bullying passages when he's at boarding school are really hard to read. But again, it's a very rewarding book, and it's something that I find that whenever I've gone back to it, I've taken more time to read it. So this most recent time, I read it over 3 months while reading other things too. But just because I know the story, so I'm not like sort of just pacing through that, but I'm really mining it for the little things. And if you want to read a very good writer who is able to capture a scene with expert ease, then Morm is for you.
Well, that's a good sales pitch if there was one. Now, the next pick of yours, I certainly wasn't surprised to see on the list, because I think it's probably the book you've talked about most, actually, when we've talked about fiction, and also happens to be the one as of yet that when I've seen it, I've instantly brought it, because I thought, oh yeah, Sam always talks about this book. It must be worth a read. So, Brideshead Revisited. When did you first read this?
Well, not actually that long ago. I read it in January.
All right.
Yeah, no, I was it's weird. Like War is one of those writers I was always aware of, and I just never got around to it. I thought, how can I relate to this? It's just, he was a bright young thing, and an Oxford aristocrat. But again, like Of Human Bondage, Brideshead Revisited is just such a wonderfully written book. And the prose is just it's so delicate and it's so just charming. And he has the same thing as Morm, where he's able to cover vast swathes of time with very little writing.
Yeah.
So yeah, the book, again, like Of Human Bondage, is about just sort of one's passage through life without a real clear story going on. But it's about relationships, and it's about his relationship with the Flight family. First, Sebastian Flight, who's a dear friend of his at Oxford, who there's I think it's probably thinly veiled subtext for War's own sexual experimentation at university, but it's a genuinely warm and intimate sort of brotherly friendship, I think. And then it moves to he becomes sort of intertwined with the Flight family as a whole, ends up romantically attached to Sebastian's sister. But at the center of it is I suppose a portrait of War's own sort of journey towards the Catholic Church, because that's what happens at the end. It kind of all, it's there and it's omnipresent in the book, and then at the end it always kind of snaps into place, and it's all at the very center of it. And at the end you find that he's converted. So the prologue and epilogue are set during the Second World War, where the protagonist Charles Ryder basically is stationed at Brideshead House, and he hasn't been there in 20 odd years. And there's a chapel, like a Catholic chapel in the on the estates, and the last scene of the actual story before the epilogue is the patriarch of the family dies, and on his deathbed he finally comes back to the Catholic faith, and everything kind of just goes from there. And at the end, he's I think the last line of the book is about how happy and content he looks, and he's come back to the faith.
Yeah, I suppose I like what you say about the idea of another long book in which not particularly very much happens in way of story as you might imagine in a lot of books, especially books written today, I think. But that leads to an event that suddenly snaps, which is very much like life. Nothing ever happens because of one particular event which shoves everything into place. There may be something that is the final, straw before something gets pushed into action, but often there's a lot of text before that occurrence takes place.
Those sort of books have had a massive influence on how I see life. It being incremental, it being made of 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah, I suppose as well, even with books that aren't necessarily like the ones you've described so far, and I think Middlemarch would be another like that, by George Eliot, where probably not very much happens. It's just about townspeople and how they live, and it's just about, again, people. But even the books which I like, and one of them we talked about on my episode, most books by Zola, they do often have storylines. There's very definite things that happen, and often there's very big things that happen. And one of them is about a big coal mining strike, so it's a pretty major event. But still, when I think back at the book, the things I remember most isn't the storyline, but interactions between people, which aren't necessarily related to the story. Some bickering at a wash house, or just some people traveling down a mine shaft and the conversation they have there every day, or the everyday meeting in the pub, which again doesn't really make a difference to the story itself. You could strip that out and the occurrences would all take place, but it's just that normal interaction which grips us. And I suppose it's sort of a quite clever author's technique, actually, to place greater emphasis not on story but on people, because we all are people and have certain interactions, whereas if something is based purely on story, we don't necessarily have all of these occurrences going on in our lives, and it might be less easy to attach to.
Also, if you want to talk about the real sort of underrated star of the show, it's the protagonist's father, who I think War kind of wrote with like a tongue-in-cheek approach, where his father's entire purpose in the story is to basically run intellectual circles around this young group of Oxford fogies. There's a really funny bit near the beginning where Charles brings a old school friend around for dinner, and his father just decides on a whim to act like the friend is American.
Right.
Keeps like making his he'll like explain English slang to him, or he'll like talk about like how's your journey across the Atlantic and that sort of thing, and the friend is just visibly confused. And he's fantastic. He's the kind of person who like will sort of misanswer a question for his own amusement. Like there's a bit again at the start where Charles goes to his father and says, I'm tight for money. What can I do? And his father said, "Oh, I can't help you. I've never been tight for money." Like knowing full well that his son's asking for money, saying, "Oh, I can't help you. I've never been there before. I can't relate."
Very good. I like that.
But it's no discussion of the book though would be complete without talking about the BBC series from 1981, which if you can't be bothered to read the book, watch that, because it is basically a word for word remake, and it's fantastic. And the prose of the novel, which, as I said before, is just very profoundly beautiful. It becomes the narration of the show, and it's fantastic. It's what's the name? Jeremy Irons plays Charles Ryder, and his voiceover is just brilliant. Yeah, I recommend it.
When was that made then? Is that back in the days when
81, I believe.
Right, yeah. Back in the days when a BBC production could be relied on to be better. I'm sure now the characters would all be cast rather differently, and there'd be an obsession on spreading certain messages rather than
certain parts of War's personal life would be a lot more on show than they are in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, but trying to batter around. A general comment on your list of books is that they're all fiction. Are you not really interested in non-fiction books, or when
it's
books, they just not feature there?
It's I love non-fiction books too, and I think we'll get on to non-fiction in a more profound way when we get to my modern Vega. Yes. It's just when I envisioned this podcast, it was going to be not necessarily the books that or films and music or people that you like, but the ones that really had a profound impact on you. Sort of made you the person you are. Because I do think sort of one of the building blocks of a person is their tastes. And so, as I was saying at the start, just fiction was just a massive part of my own personal and intellectual development, more so than nonfiction. Although I am still very fond of nonfiction books, and I have plenty behind me. I tend to be reading 2 books at once: one fiction, one nonfiction.
Yeah, that's quite right. Well, your next choice, it's a good job this isn't Desert Island Disc, because if it was, I think you'd need to take a bit of a bigger case, because it's not one book as such, but is it 9, I think? 9 books in a series. So tell us about the series of books this time you've chosen.
Well, again, I was trying to think of what books were there for me when I was a teenager, and what were there for me when I was a young man, and then I also had to go what books were there for me when I was a kid, and I couldn't go that far back, so I end up with like Enid Blyton and
Mr. Man.
Yeah, exactly, and Dr. Seuss and and Roald Dahl and that sort of thing. But when I was about so anyway, so without further ado, my third choice is the Sherlock Holmes series.
Yeah,
which I don't know, like I was maybe 10 or 11 when I first started reading them. My grandmother just gave me a collection of so there's one big brick of a book with 15 or 20 stories in there, and I just loved it. I was at the age where I was very influenced by things. I wanted to be a detective, and I think I went as Sherlock for Halloween 3 years in a row. I just loved it. I loved the way it was written. I loved the time period. I loved the sort of the adventure, just how sort of brilliant Holmes was, but how like he was humanized by Watson. It was a really great double act, and probably it's probably inspired so many double acts in comedy and in investigation and crime genres. And it's a book that it's a series and a set of characters that completely stand alone, despite being echoed by a myriad of other authors since then.
Yeah. Well, you said you wanted this series, and in particular, the pick on books to be about what shaped your character. And I think out of all fiction works, Sherlock Holmes is pretty much the sort of quintessential English character, which I don't doubt also had an impact on you as you.
Yeah, no, exactly. It shaped what I thought the sort of the Englishman should be, which is eccentric, wickedly intelligent, devoted to a craft or profession to the point of obsession, to the point of I'm sure you could retroactively diagnose Holmes with some sort of Asperger's or autism, especially with the BBC remake where Benedict Cumberbatch really plays up sort of the social awkwardness of Holmes. I don't know. It's a great book or set of books to really lose yourself in and just enjoy kind of the escapades and the fun and the romp, and it's a bit camp at times as well. Again, and it's written from the point of view of Holmes, so it's like of Watson. So it's it's a sort of it's the straight man kind of trying to understand this bizarre eccentric genius, and I love that like dynamic between sort of the straight laced, normal person and the eccentric.
Yeah, I like that. Well, as well, you talked about being fun stories or the escapades and that. Something else other than Sherlock Holmes, just more generally, which is always seen as being sort of, especially in America, I think, as being English, is enemies, the bad guy. So out of all the stories, do you have a favorite story out of the selection that you remember from you were younger, and in particular, a favorite sort of bad guy or villain that Holmes had to try and conquer?
I think it has to be the Reichenbach Falls. It's I think it's called The Final Problem. And it's so Moriarty is the sort of the counteracting force to Holmes. He's a super genius villain. And it's just the culmination of their sort of their grappling, and they end up on the Reichenbach Falls, and it's believed that Holmes is dead, and he's not. But I think the TV show kind of tries to modernize it, and it didn't quite work because it's sort of what was special about The Final Problem is that the final scene on the Reichenbach Falls is it's these two sort of genius men, but they're up against a sort of a beast of nature that can destroy them both without thinking about it. It's like both of them are completely disempowered by the falls. So it almost doesn't matter who the better man is. They're both sort of paling in comparison to it. And it's just, I think it's the one where, because I think the British mindset is I think a lot more realist than the American one. There's a famous quote from Ricky Gervais that Americans are told that they'll be the next president, and Brits are told that it won't be them. So I think we like to see our heroes kind of fallible. And it's the most vulnerable Holmes ever looks in those stories.
Is that portrayed in one of the films rather than the TV series? I seem to remember
it's portrayed in the TV series, but it's like a different thing. It's like Moriarty basically like gaslights Holmes into like losing everything, and like says like your one chance to save everyone you love is to jump from this building.
Right.
So it's a skyscraper, not a waterfall. But I'm not sure. Maybe one of the films that I haven't really. I mean, I never watched the Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law films.
I think it might be one of them.
Right? Yeah, I never bothered with those. I didn't like that an American was playing. I didn't like an American playing Holmes.
No, well, that might trump then my next question, which was, what do you think of the adaptations? So you've not seen them ones, but what about? I mean, they did one recently, didn't they? With was it just called Sherlock, where it was the chap from The Office as Watson?
Yeah. That's the one with the building. Yeah, the TV show.
Right.
I mean,
sort
look,
of modern day Holmes, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, nothing compares to Arthur Conan Doyle's original stories. Nothing compares to them. I think it's a decent adaptation in that it's faithful, but it's like modern, and there's all. It's okay, but I will say this is that one memory that I have from being a kid that I really cherish deeply is watching a very little known one called Young Sherlock Holmes with my sister when I was about maybe 8 or 9. It's before I'd even read the books, and it's looking back on it, it's probably not very good.
Right.
But as a kid watching it, I was mesmerized by it. So that's the one that I like from adaptations, and yeah, I think the BBC one's okay. I mean, I like the kind of the whole angle of Watson being sort of PTSD ridden Afghan war veteran in the first few episodes, and and there's a lot of fan service with all the references to 221B and the hat and that sort of thing. But again, I don't think anything can really come close to the originals, because as books, aside from my own sort of personal attachment or sentiment, they are just remarkably well written books.
Yeah, I think we'll stop on that and go over to the musical picks.
Mm-hmm.
So the first of which then, no, I must say I was expecting your free book picks. I wasn't surprised by them. And not actually so surprised on the music, but slightly further down the line, I am, as you'll find out. But this one, I suppose, we've talked about quite a bit. It's the Beach Boys. 1966 album. Tell us a little bit more about this then.
So Pet Sounds is the album, and it's there was an old marketing ploy around the time called basically called Brian Wilson is a genius, right? That's what everyone said about Brian Wilson. It was sort of like like a sort of word of mouth, like I suppose viral marketing campaign for the band. When you listen to this record and also Smile, it's very hard to disagree with that statement. Especially when you look into the recording process. I mean, because Brian Wilson, who is somebody who is almost like I'd say it's like a creative Icarus, someone almost like kind of like Sid Barrett, someone who really, really went out there, really pushed the boat out, but flew too close to the sun. Right. So in the mid '60s to late '60s, there was this interesting back and forth between the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Because the Beatles, released I think it was Revolver or Rubber Soul. I think it was Rubber Soul, and Brian Wilson basically listened to it and said, "I don't want to make surf pop anymore. Right. I don't want to sing about fun and beach and girls and surfing." And like he was tired of it, and he wanted to make a real magnum opus. And he set about crafting this record while the rest of the band were on tour. So they basically came back and he made a record without them. Right. And during that time, he got heavily into LSD, and it did two things to him. One, it brought the very best out of him creatively, but it broke him. Right. And the 70s and 80s were very, very rough for Brian Wilson. Right. But on the record itself, I mean, it's just fantastic. And Brian Wilson is like a pathological perfectionist, and he would get the cellists playing like on loop over it for hours and hours and hours, and he completely alienated the rest of the band, but he earned the respect of the musicians because they were like, we've worked with the very best, and you're better than them. Right. Personal highlights from the record are Caroline No, Sloop John B, Wouldn't It Be Nice? I mean, it's all the typical ones. You Still Believe in Me. There's just this like kind of wall of sound approach, but there's always this very bizarre things going on. Like at one point, there's two different bass lines playing in two different keys, and they were trying to tell him, this is not going to work. And he said, "Well, it works in my head," and it did. And it did, And he had this he could sort of make music in his mind in a very clear and lucid way, and it came across after a lot of hard work, but it came across really well.
Like Beethoven.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Brian Wilson is. I mean, it's kind of. I feel kind of bad for him because. For a good couple of years, I think he was the most innovative, creative genius in all of pop music. But people think Beach Boys, they're that poppy, happy California surf band. Yeah. When he hated that image. By the time this came out, he hated that image because they didn't surf, like they didn't surf, and real surfers didn't like their music.
Right. Not like Dick Dale then in that sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and But yeah, so this album it's painstakingly created. It's lovingly crafted. It took hours and hours and hours of work, recordings, re-recordings. I think everyone went a bit insane. But what comes out of it is a record that completely stands the test of time. And now like 40 odd years, 45 years removed, it's still, I think, objectively the best pop record I've made.
Well, I mean, one of my first thoughts, I was actually shocked when I found out researching for this that it was from 1966 because it sounds so fresh still. I mean, you hear when you listen to some of the songs on it, you think you can't believe it was written that many years ago. Actually, especially considering that a lot of the music from that time could have been very fairly simple, basic structures, fairly repetitive. Whereas, like you said, there's a lot of imaginative ideas going on here, things that were new. The two bass lines idea, even in Wouldn't It Be Nice? I think it's not amazingly technical, but quite rare at least. There's a downwards key change in the song, which doesn't happen very often at the beginning. So there's a lot going on, which is quite experimental, as you say. Certainly new at the time, very very experimental. But even now, after another 60, 70 years of music, it still feels fresh, doesn't feel old or dated. And I think that in itself is testament to the skill and the hours, as you say, that went behind it.
Yeah, and even in the Beach Boys like canon, it's drastically unlike anything they made before it, but it still had bits of sort of vintage Beach Boys. It had the melodies that defined their early sound was still there. Like it's just yeah, no, it's fantastic, and there's a sort of spiritual sequel to it in the album Smile. Sorry, Smiley Smile, which was originally going to be Brian Wilson's kind of magnum opus, but he basically lost his mind while he was making it, and then the other band sort of members sort of stepped in, and it became Smiley Smile, which still has echoes of that genius, like it's not like Good Vibrations, which is on it, which is again for the time it's completely revolutionary.
Yeah, yeah. Now, one of the topics you mentioned with that is something I was going to ask on with the next pick. So I think we could possibly slide into this, and then we'll talk more about the next album itself. And it was your mention of the drugs, the LSD, and the other pick you've got. The second pick is "Let It Be" by the Beatles, which I think is famous for LSD and other drugs, especially in slightly later period, as influencing some of its music and shifting their lives. And then also the politics of some of the musicians is very famous. It's very well known. It's part of the Beatles' image. And my question on that was, how do you think this fits in with your own view of the world and your own way of living? I mean, do you think we should look past these things in reference to art, that simply the product is what matters, or do you think these sorts of questions are still important?
There's a balancing of the scale. I think there's a ratio to be measured out of, on one hand, how egregious the individuals actually are, and two, how good the art is. Yeah, I think someone like, I'm not really a particularly big fan of John Lennon as a solo artist, and I think Imagine is just a piece of crap. But I mean, I think the artistry of the late Beatles period is it's utterly phenomenal, and I don't find them that egregious.
Right.
The whole thing, going to India and kind of we're all grains of sand in the cosmic beach. I mean, I think I can sort of roll my eyes at that a little bit, but I can justify it because an album like Let It Be is just fantastic. And it's an interesting one because it really is their swan song. Because by this point, I mean, the band is completely falling apart. George Harrison's basically being dominated by the other two, and he goes away and writes All Things Must Pass, which is a brilliant record. And then within months, McCartney and Lennon are basically writing diss tracks back and forth. So it's really an album that comes together in the production because they spent such little time together while making the albums as well during Abbey Road. But again, it's like, I think it is just their swan song. Like the title track, Let It Be, the guitar solo after the first chorus, to me always felt like it was kind of them saying goodbye. It's such the energy it carries is like this kind of solemn farewell, the explosion of passion, and it's yeah. To answer your question, I don't think the Beatles were, I mean, evil. And I think their music, while I'm not exactly a big fan of free love and psychedelia, in the social and sexual sphere, I can't not listen to this and not feel something profound, almost psychedelic. It's like they're doing the drugs for me,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but again, with this record, you can't talk about it without talking about the Rooftop Concert, which was made on the fly during production. They just went up to the roof and started playing. That is, I think, it's them at their best, which is funny because in hindsight, it's them. It's the dark before the dawn. They're literally on the verge of walking away. But they played this one gig, and it's really good concert. It's really good. I think it's been taken off YouTube, but the full concert's on Vimeo, and I recommend anyone go check it out because it's fantastic, and there's really good melodies. Songs like I've Got a Feeling, Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, they're just brilliantly played. And it's like, to me, that's sort of testament to them, where even though at this point they probably despise each other, they still got together and made fantastic music.
Yeah, absolutely. And am I right in thinking that you said before that some of the live sections sort of interwoven in the album, that they sort of incorporated within the pieces.
Yeah. So John's sort of now famous like closing line after the gig is well, that's a thank you all and hope we pass the audition.
Right.
Obviously, 10 years into a globe conquering career. That features at the end, and yeah, there's little bits too, and there's actually a really good bit in the live concert where they're playing. It's the last song they're playing, "Get Back," again, because they play it twice in the live set, and Paul starts like ad-libbing lyrics because there's like police everywhere, like threatening to arrest them.
Right.
Like ad-libbing lyrics about like getting arrested and the cops coming and that sort of thing. Yeah, it just listen, just watch it. It's brilliant. It's just like also it's iconic. It is a moment in cultural history that's just iconic. Also, like imagine just being on your lunch break and just hearing the Beatles playing on the rooftops nearby.
Yeah.
Incredible.
It's one of those events, I think, which can only happen once and have the same effect. If the biggest group today, whoever that may be, were to do the same thing, then you sort of think, yeah, this has been done already. So you're right, it is sort of a moment of history which just can't be repeated.
No, absolutely. And if it was to be repeated, it just wouldn't work. I mean, Paul McCartney did a gig on Rooftop, but obviously by this point he was in his 60s and couldn't go as hard as
Sing.
yeah, exactly, yeah. Just wouldn't, also like think about like a modern pop star doing that. They'd be like, it wouldn't be just an on the fly thing. It would be so over prepared that it would just have like no authentic energy to it. It would just be completely astroturfed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think? Since you mentioned it, of Paul McCartney still performing now at his age in the same way as he used to? It's not sort of acoustic sets now. It's still, at least until recently, from what I know, big arenas, full band, as it once was. I mean, with a voice that just isn't there, and it just sounds, it sounds really odd to me. I mean, obviously, it's. I understand the desire to carry on, and I think anybody who is really into their trade says they want to do it until they literally can't, and just finish on stage. But I don't know, it's sort of, it leaves a bit of a sour taste to me.
Yeah, no,
back.
I know what you mean. Like there comes a time where you're better off just walking away than to carry on and tarnish it. Because I mean, if you listen to Paul McCartney's like most recent album, I mean, the songwriting's gone off a cliff. I mean, it's not where it was.
Yeah,
he's not writing Yesterday and Blackbird anymore. He's writing just kind of tosh, really.
Yeah, I suppose it's with music you can carry on because it's it's supposedly subjective. You can still put a song out even if it's crap and people will still buy it. Whereas with other activities, other jobs, there can come a time when you literally just can't do it. So you have to stop. You say with a sport, even if you can physically do it, you're not what you once were, and you think, what's the point of doing this? I'm not going to get where I used to be, and it's quite obvious. And I think it's a shame sometimes that musicians don't realize the same and think, yeah, I'm gonna put it down here. I'm gonna help other musicians, maybe become a producer and do things like this rather than focus on the writing itself, because I think that lets it down a bit.
Yeah, no, I think it's just better infinitely to go out on a high than to sort of limp along, carried by nostalgia and nostalgia alone. Because I don't think Paul McCartney's new music could sell out an arena.
No,
you wouldn't go there to hear him sing about his seventh wife. You go there to hear Hey Jude, Let It Be.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you've mentioned nostalgia and the past, so we'll shoot very much further past for your last musical pick, which is Ave Maria by Schubert. Now Schubert, I suppose, he's a great composer. He's my grandfather's favorite, so I've got hundreds of records, more than of anybody else. And he's got lots of famous pieces of work. The Trout is quite well known for doing different sorts of music. So not just quartets and things like this, but septets and octets, things like that, which is interesting. But it's probably best known for piano singer. And he's got all sorts of really famous classical arrangements of this. If you hear a simple bit of music with piano and singer, it's most likely Schubert. And of course, the most famous of them is Ave Maria. So tell us a bit why this is your
Yeah,
third pick for me.
I thought I'd go for something a bit more conservative, a bit more sort of classic and elegant, and well, there is a slight caveat to mine in that it's a particular performance of Ave Maria, and
Yes, yes, that was a question.
it's Luciano Pavarotti's rendition, which I mean, don't get me wrong, I find the version with the female vocalist equally powerful and equally sort of stunning, and it always, but there's a certain thing that just makes my knees go weak, and I can barely stand, and I had to just literally sit or lay down or recline back. But with Pavarotti's version, it goes from being profound and almost holy to just being powerful. And like Pavarotti is someone who, obviously, growing up where and when I did, I wasn't exposed to very much. But when he died, I think around 2006, I think he died. His music was suddenly all over the radio. And I remember I was in the car with my mum going somewhere, and it came on his version. It was a live version from Wembley Arena, and I was just like, I was just mesmerized by it, and because I was 10 at the time, so I didn't I didn't really have the means to go find it. The internet wasn't what it is now, but I've since rediscovered it, and Pavarotti is just someone who can just fill a room with his voice, and it's so powerful, it's so profound. And one thing I always do as well is when it comes to opera, obviously most of them are in either German or Italian or French. I make a very clear point not to know what's actually being said.
Yeah, there's a bit of a, I'm in two minds about that, because you see, I said about my grandfather's influence on classical music. He speaks fluent Italian, speaks quite good German, or at least can read German, I should say. So often sits with the libretto and enjoys reading it. And the odd, well, I've actually only been, I think, to one opera, and it wasn't a proper opera. It was I think they call it what do they call, I don't know what they call it, but there's no acting. It was just the music, whatever they call it, symphony opera, I don't know. And again, the lyrics were there, and you're tempted to look at it, but I think I'm on your side actually on this. I don't want to know. The odds, say when I'm listening to Handel, like the Messiah oratorio, I really enjoy it, but hearing the words just distracts me. It doesn't feel right. I think in these cases, fine. Often the lyrics are very moving. Beethoven wrote Ode of Joy not because he liked the singing necessarily. I'm sure that's part of it, but because the lyrics themselves were important. It was about unity and brotherhood. But at the same time, the voice is an instrument, and someone like Pavarotti proves that beyond anything. I suppose if you've got a second-rate singer, then maybe you're more interested in the lyrics. But when you've got someone like Pavarotti singing, you don't care what he's singing.
No,
the voice itself is so tremendous. That you're in another world. Words don't matter,
because it's angelic. It's almost like an alien language. In that I don't know what's being said, and I'm fine with that. Which is so unlike me, because I'm normally the kind of person who, if I'm watching a film and I see like a visual effect, I have to know how they did it, and I have to know how things work behind the scenes. I have to know how everything works. I have to know what everything means. But with this, it's like one of the very few things where I can just relax and not have any desire to know what it is. And I can just enjoy this kind of, this completely foreign, just angelic whispering. And it's something that I return to a lot. And I don't have to be in a particular mood, or I don't look to be put into a particular mood. It's just, it's for the length of that piece of music. I'm nowhere, I'm just kind of floating.
We'll move over from music then to film. Now, when we talk sort of casually outside of magazine discussions, we talk a lot about music, but we might actually talk more, if not an equal amount of time, about films. And we both have a love, especially for spaghetti westerns. My pick was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and I was sort of expecting Fistful of Dollars, Few Dollars More, or Once Upon a Time in the West. So I was slightly surprised and thought perhaps the pixels on my screen were not working correctly when I saw Mr. Bean's Holiday.
Mr. Bean's Holiday, yeah.
So explain. I mean,
it's the best one I've made.
Yeah, you're gonna have to sell that one to me. I think.
Okay. This is a very like kind of personal choice. Okay, but also I had a bit of bad luck here because I had this weird curse where pretty much every film that I picked, someone else in the series nicked before me. So my
Right.
first choice was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which you picked.
Very good.
And you did in our, I think I mentioned it because we did a pilot episode that ended up being episode 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And then it was Wiffnell and I, and Alexander Adams had that one. And Midnight in Paris, but Paul Embry had that one.
Mm.
So I started thinking about not a film I really enjoy watching, but a film I like have watched my entire life and will probably watch for the rest of my life and pass down to my kids, whatever. And it's Mr. Bean's Holiday, and I think it's I'm pretty doing a bad job of selling it, but it's just the most like lovable, sort of just innocent kind of comedic film, and the end is fantastic. And I had a good chat with Reba about this because the last scene is like
I've not heard. I'd love to hear you and Craney.
honestly, we were in agreement. We were in agreement about it.
Oh no!
We both said the ending of that
What's
film is
Bournbrook become?
the ending of that film is absolutely fantastic. I recommend everyone go and watch it because at its heart, it's a film about a simple man who ultimately gets the simple desire he wants, which is to go to this nice view on the French Riviera, right? And in the end, he gets it, and his face is just one of pure joy. And Rowan Atkinson, I know Mr. Bean is seen as being kind of like it's a weird like PG family friendly, dated comedy show, but it's the physical humor is very good, and Rowan Atkinson's a very smart comedian, but he's like very good at doing like emotive bits as well. And the bit at the end where like he finally gets to the view of the French Riviera, there's this look on his face, and it's just one of just pure, absolute, like almost childlike joy. And then it kicks into like a sort of weird cover of Charles Tennett's Le Maire, while the whole cast sort of sing along, and it gets weird, like kind of musical camp vibes. But like, it's just such a brilliant film, and you walk away from it kind of just like sort of smiling to yourself. I recommend everyone go and watch it before you sort of laugh at me for picking Mr. Bean's Holiday, but it's just it's a genuinely fantastic film.
I have seen it, admittedly, and I do remember having enjoyed it. And I think what you said there about sort of him, the emotional scenes. I watch a lot of Don Rickles clips. I find them really amusing, and it's great when he's ripping out of everybody in the audience constantly. It's non-stop. It's relentless. But then at the very end, he'll turn to the host and say, but in all seriousness, I respect you. You've helped me in my career, and I love you and your wife, and I think you're both brilliant. And thanks very much. God bless. And you're waiting for a punchline, he doesn't give one, and and the fact that he's capable of both ripping out of everybody, but then also giving this really heartfelt message is like, oh wow, that's quite nice. So I see what you mean with the Mr. Bean bit. His face is so ridiculous through the whole program and amazingly slow. I mean, he's incredibly talented. A moment of sort of small bliss is, if anything, more powerful because you're sort of waiting for the punchline, it doesn't come, and you go, oh right, that's quite.
Jeremy, I mean, if you look at like comedy, like you have shows like Always Sunny in Philadelphia, or like even like Seinfeld, or even Peep Show, where the characters are like, they're either like sort of smooth, cracking wise asses like Seinfeld, or they're just like kind of just generally psychopathic people like Always Sunny, or just like cynical and self-interested like Peep Show. But Mr. Bean, he's like, yeah, he gets in the way and he sort of causes chaos, and he like sort of, it's always like innocent-minded. There's no malice behind Mr. Bean. Like Mr. Bean isn't capable of like like doing bad stuff. But so he's just like a sort of grown child. But like there's just the wonder in his face is I really recommend everyone go and watch the last scene of that film. Where he like walks down to the beach because it's great.
I suppose it's one of those where people have sort of grown up watching Mr. Bean for years. Not as much now, actually. I mean, I remember when I was young, it was Mr. Bean's cartoon everywhere. I didn't watch that because I had the DVD, so I did watch the proper thing. I sort of caught a glimpse of the cartoon, which was horrendous. You always worry when you've got these characters that everyone loves, that they're going to ruin it when they do a film. And they didn't actually. It was well done. And the same with Johnny English, which is a different character, obviously, but pretty much in the same vein, where actually they lived up to expectation, I think, until the second and third days. But
I mean, there's a few bits where you're like, yeah. There's one bit where there's like a sort of commissioned like chummy 2006 pop song playing during like a road trip scene. But I mean, apart from that, I mean, it stays free of kind of being tainted. It's just like obviously it's grander and the budget's bigger and the image is more like crisp, but like because like the old Mr. Bean is a very sort of low quality, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's very basic. It's just
Yeah.
but brilliant for it, I think. So okay, fair enough. You've slightly won me over on that. I was slightly shocked when I saw it, but we'll let you off. But we'll go on to the next one then. And I think you're going to need a bit of an obvious question first. We're going on to item here, and you've said a tennis ball. So the obvious first question is this a tennis ball or a tennis ball?
It's less a tennis ball and more kind of what I would do with it. So
So it's any tennis ball is what you mean?
yeah, I had I probably went through about 30 in my time, just sort of breaking them and that sort of thing. But no, so I mentioned earlier in the podcast about like how as a kid stammering was quite a sort of serious like thing in my life. The other thing too was so for the first like 7 years of my life, there was like kind of something wrong with me, but like no one really knew what. And then when I was 8, I was diagnosed with dyspraxia, which is like a sort of like a motor coordination thing. I don't know. It's basically it's like a neuroatypicality, and like there's like a list of like 20 possible symptoms. And you'll have like 5 of them. And for me, the whole thing was at first my hand-eye coordination was like dreadful. Like I couldn't catch anything.
Right.
Like you could throw like a basketball maybe from 3 feet away, and I'd drop it. So what I would do is I got a tennis ball, and I would just like throw it and catch it like that. At first, I couldn't do it, and for about 5 years, I did it every day. And then within that 5 years, over the course of it, I basically trained myself to like have good hand-eye coordination through that. So it's like I've always done. I've always got a tennis ball like in like the drawer on my bed, and 5-10 minutes, I just like literally throw and catch it. And now I can like basically put one hand like out here and like throw it so like it lands perfectly like off the wall, like rebound.
Don't show off.
Well, okay, I'll show off. But yeah, no, it's basically I just trained out like a defect in my brain with a tennis ball, so it's like a weird like muscle memory thing now, but like it's yeah, it was a big springboard for me, really.
Yeah, I was expecting sort of, I don't know, a long lost relative's tennis ball that's been passed down, or someone that won at Wimbledon years ago that you managed to catch later on. That was a bit of a curveball.
I caught an out at Wimbledon. Yeah, no, it's just that. I just found it one day because like I don't know why, but my family did like tennis every like 3 months. There's always like rackets and balls around the house. So I just picked one up when I was about 8 and just started messing around with it.
Right, so we'll move on to the people section, and one of them is from times gone by, and we've got a re-mention of a name already featured in the episode. I almost said the issue there. I think this is in print. So tell us about the first person that you'd like to meet. Let's say.
So the first one, yes, as we mentioned before, is W. Somerset Maugham, the author of the aforementioned Of Human Bondage. Also, some other great books: Razor's Edge, Moon and Sixpence, Ashendon, which is like a sort of collection of like spy stories based on his real life exploits. He was a spy during the First World War. So he's based in like neutral countries, and that informs like this interesting sort of spy series that's very like kind of realist. It sort of accounts for the sort of the boredom and the sort of the sort of mundane nature of spying. A lot of waiting, a lot of sort of going somewhere, then like sort of having to leave immediately because you've been blown cover or that sort of thing.
Right.
As well, also he writes a very fantastic autobiography called A Writer's Handbook, and that was a big thing reading as well. Shortly after reading Of Human Bondage, where I first sort of wanted to write. Yeah, that was big. Also, yeah, it just as I said earlier, he wrote what I think is a English literary masterpiece.
Has he inspired you to write fiction ever? I'm not sure if you've ever written any non.
Yeah, no, I it's sort of my other pipeline dream. I'm sort of slowly building up 2 at the moment. I won't say too much about or anything about them, but yeah.
I'd like to have a read of them if you'd be willing to pass them out. That'd be great.
Yeah, I've got a few chapters sort of done. If you want to read some chapters, that's cool.
Yeah, I'd love to. Excellent.
Yeah.
Back to Mon. Is it his writing itself, or the man himself, that you're
Well,
most intrigued by?
I actually I know very little about the man himself on like a sort of intimate, detailed level.
Right.
I know rough things because basically a lot about his life can be gleaned from of human bondage.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
it very much follows his life. You know, he was orphaned at a young age. He had like a sort of a humiliating sort of deformity. He even parts of his life where he studied in Germany, then trained to be a doctor in London. Like all this, like that's all real life things. So but on a level that would cause inspiration, I know very little about the man. So it is mostly his writing and the stories he tells, and the image of a certain time and place that I have, which is sort of intellectual circles in London in the Edwardian era,
Yeah, yeah.
which I find as sort of an image and as an idyll so sort of intoxicating.
Mm.
It's for me it's very fun, like to escape in that kind of era, and
Yeah.
I think he depicts it better than anyone.
Mm. From his writing, are there characters which you're intrigued about
Hmm.
the influence for, or some plots that you are sort of
Hmm.
wondering what the deeper meaning is behind them?
Not necessarily deep meaning, but things I find very interesting. So his book Moon and Sixpence is loosely based on Paul Gauguin, the French painter, who basically he lived a sort of comfortable sort of nouveau riche life in Paris, which he just abandoned to go to I think Tahiti and paint and lived among the natives and painted them, and eventually died very slowly and painfully of I think malaria. Um, and then so it's based on that, and but it's sort of shifted slightly. So it's an English writer who's a sort of stockbroker in London who moves to Paris and then to Tahiti. But it's an absolute masterclass in winning the reader over to a character who's not a good person.
Right.
So the central character is not the narrator. The narrator is like a writer who basically follows this guy to Paris and then to Tahiti. Um, but the main character is so unlikable for 2/3 of the novel, and then at the end of it, because at the end you realize that the reason he was miserable and therefore a bad person was because his home wasn't where he grew up or where he lived. Like he found his home in Tahiti, and the last years of the life he's happy and peaceful and sort of romantic.
Right.
So it's a way of like justifying a character who's just a dick for like the entire book up until that point.
And then killing him slowly and painfully.
Yeah, I don't know if it was malaria. Oh no, it was leprosy.
Right.
I don't know if that's how Gauguin died, but that's how the character dies in this.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's just I don't know. It's like you see a character from a completely different angle, and the way it's written is just it works wonderfully. Yeah, he's a fantastic writer. I've got behind me is quite a lot of his books, which I've sort of slowly read and committed across time. But he's written a lot of stuff. So it took me a good sort of decade to get through it all.
Yeah, there's too many books in this world, I think, is the problem. Excellent. And your last pick then, your last thing on the list, and the last person, the contemporary person, is surprisingly not been mentioned yet in the series.
No, he hasn't. No.
Unlike your other film choices.
Yeah.
So you've not had to go with Mr. Bean here, but you've chosen the proper pick, which is Sir Roger Scruton. Which I thought was a really interesting pick for a number of reasons. I mean, it made me think straight away that I remember it in 2016 during the US election, which was just after I got out of a phase of reading a lot of Christopher Hitchens. I thought I'd be really, really interested to know what Christopher Hitchens thought about this election, because he would obviously have despised Donald Trump. This essentially a phony, bit of a hack, in it for himself, and just also ludicrous, while also funny. But also absolutely loathed the Clintons and could never tell anybody to vote for the Clintons. I think he viewed the Clintons as being the worst of the worst. So I'd really have loved to have heard his take on the situation. And the reason I say this is that I don't think there are many matters that go on today since the relatively recent passing of Sir Roger Scruton, where I don't think it would have been interesting to have heard his take on this. I mean, especially over the past year with lockdowns and sort of the I suppose, some of the philosophical questions that could be raised from that. It would have been genuinely interesting to hear his take on the matter.
He would have despaired at the loss of human spirit. I mean, he operated on a level so much higher than the low politics or people who tried to bring him down.
Yeah.
You know, he saw what really matters in life, which is beautiful things, deep connections with things and people and, you know, places. And quite simply put, I mean, I picked him because he is the man who made me conservative.
Right.
Quite, it's as simple as that. I think everyone has like a sort of their sort of mainstream conservative thinker who brings them into it. And for some, it's Peter Hitchens. For some, it's the more American brand people like, you know, I hardly call them conservatives, but, you know, Ben Shapiro, Stephen Crowder, that sort of thing.
Can still lead you down the right path at the very least.
Yeah, it can be. It's a gateway drug. Yeah, it's a gateway drug. Or for some, it's Jordan Peterson. For some, it's Joe Rogan. For me, it was Scruton. For me, it was because so when I was in college, it was. I mean, it was before the sort of the cultural thing kind of really sort of took off and became hostile, but it was still, you know, very liberal. So it was like 2012, and it was back when, you know, the big issues of the day were like, you know, fox hunting and student fees and austerity. I was doing a politics A level, and my teacher was very kind of, you know, hyper progressive, and, you know, and among all that noise, the only thing that ever really made sense or like even sounded coherent or even pleasant was Scruton, and I was introduced to him via pejorative. The teacher basically denounced him as being this kind of, you know, this like tobacco shitting racist. And I was kind of apolitical, weirdly, doing politics at A level, but I sort of was like, oh, check him out. And then I was just completely taken aback by it because it wasn't screeching, you know, because it's wonderfully written. And whatever he writes about, there's love in there, like love for what he's writing about, and also love of language itself. You know, he writes amazingly. So does Peter Hitchens too. Peter Hitchens is, you know, he's his commentary is biting and on point, but his writing in his books is very good.
Yeah, that's an interesting point there. As he sort of hinted at there, he had so many different areas that he wrote about, thought about, and had an influence on. If you had half an hour to talk to him, and you sort of knew, I can only really go on one topic, otherwise it's going to be just 2 words on each, what is it you'd be most interested to talk to him about?
Wine.
Fair enough.
Because the rest of it I can literally just watch a lecture or an interview. Because the rest of it is like if you want to like understand Scruton's thought in, like, you know, several topics, it's architecture, music, belonging, and that's probably it, right? Those 3 principles. He wrote a book about wine called "I Drink Therefore I Am," and it's you know, it's very funny, and it's weird because I I kind of laugh at the idea of him sort of sitting down at his, you know, fancy oak desk to write to write about wine, you know, pretty well drinking it, getting a piss, you know, like that. I find it hilarious, but I think wine, because, you know, he wrote a book about it, and he's done a few things about it, but like there's not that much out there about him on wine. So I love wine, you know that.
I do indeed. No, that's a good answer.
Mm.
What do you think his impact, lasting impact, will be? I mean, I'm going to give a cynical thing for you to respond to, because, you know, I very much like Scruton too and enjoy his writing. But the committees he was on, I mean, certainly some of the work he did in the east of Europe was very impressive.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I forgot to mention that he's a hero in the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, but say in Britain today, well, I suppose perhaps the most important thing is something I'll get to at the end of this. But on architecture, I mean, we hoped there was some good to come when he was added onto the what was it? Something about building better, actually. Building
back, building beautiful. Yeah.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. So there was this, but he got kicked off, and then of course he sadly died shortly after he was added back on. And we know that the advice he will have given in that short time will all be ignored anyway. And I suppose one of the main points, I mean, there's been a lot of arguments recently, I suppose, thanks to the tax hikes around the Conservative Party, which, as far as I know, at least most of his life, but I think until the end, he supported, despite everything. Despite all his writing, he was still a supporter, in name at least, of the Conservative Party. Although I suppose what I would say will be his his impact is what you said, which is that he made you conservative, and hopefully his writing will be seen by enough people in the future to make them conservative too. But what would you say on the other points about his support for the party and aspects like that?
Well, I mean, I think he passed before it really hit the depth it has now. You know,
Hmm.
I mean, the Tory party of January 2020 and the Tory party of today are very different. It's I mean, sure, then it was still a self-interested Machiavellian party that's the assigned party of global capital. But I
Yeah.
mean, I can't imagine he'd support the party at this point. I can't imagine he'd support lockdown.
No.
You know, I think by this point, because he was a morally upstanding man. It doesn't matter what the people who set him up and trapped him and tried to ruin his name think of him. He's a man of immense moral character.
Hmm.
I genuinely think, well, I know he would have stood for the right thing, which is basically any conservative alternative to the Conservative Party.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, I think on that, unless there's anything else you want to say on Scruton, in which case I'll...
No,
No.
I think it's a good one to leave it off.
Okay. Well, I think on that, that is, as I always say at the end of the episodes, your life in 10. Thanks very much.